The edge of winter, December 5, 1941. The outskirts of Moscow, Russia. A brittle wind cut through the shattered villages and frozen fields like a blade, carrying the acrid smoke of abandoned fires and the faint stench of diesel from tanks that had been left to die in the snow. Lieutenant General Hermann Hoth pulled his fur-lined coat tighter against his body, the coarse wool biting at his skin as he surveyed the horizon from a shallow trench. His breath rose in ragged clouds, each one freezing almost instantly into tiny crystalline shards that hung in the air before dissolving into the white void. The German advance had been relentless. Weeks ago, Berlin had celebrated the capture of Smolensk and the seemingly unstoppable march toward the Soviet capital. The Blitzkrieg, a term coined to glorify their lightning war, had promised speed, shock, and dominance. Yet now, as Hoth squinted through the swirling snow, the illusion of invincibility shattered before his eyes. On the frozen roads, panzer divisions sat immobile, their engines seized by the merciless cold. Tracks crunched over ice that seemed to form a brittle mirror, reflecting the bleak gray sky. Mechanized infantry soldiers, frostbitten and hollow-eyed, huddled in the shadow of their tanks, rifles clasped, but useless against the elements. Boots encrusted with ice and blood left jagged trails across the snow, testaments to men pushed beyond human endurance. Hoth's eyes flicked to the horizon again, searching for signs of the enemy, but the landscape offered only an endless expanse of white. Yet he knew the Red Army was there, not in massed formations like before, but in pockets, harassing supply lines and exploiting every weakness. Each gust of wind seemed to carry the echo of Soviet artillery, muffled and ghost-like, yet insistent. Nearby, a young lieutenant struggled with a jammed rifle, cursing under his breath as his fingers, red and raw from frostbite, refused to obey. The general wanted to move forward, to push for the city that had been his obsession, but each step forward now felt like dragging a weight of ice. The roads were clogged with abandoned trucks, frozen corpses, and the occasional skeleton of a horse, left behind by retreating Soviet cavalry. Hoth's mind wandered to the briefings he had received in Berlin, to the confident faces of officers who had assured him Moscow would fall by winter. He swallowed the bitter taste of failure, the gnawing awareness that the war, as they had envisioned it, might be slipping from their grasp. And then he felt it, the bone-deep cold, not just an enemy, but a predator stalking the German army. It was relentless, impartial, and unforgiving. A thin sun barely broke through the clouds, casting pale shadows that did nothing to warm the earth. Soldiers whispered among themselves, their voices fragile, in the wind, speaking of frostbite, starvation, and the myth of their unstoppable march. And in that moment, as he watched the first signs of frost forming on the edge of his map, Hoth knew something the generals back in Berlin refused to admit. The war was no longer a matter of tactics or skill. It was a battle against nature itself, and nature was win. Section 2. The First Blows of Winter. December 10, 1941. The approaches to Moscow, a frozen hellscape. The cold had become a living thing, creeping into every crevice of uniform, every seam of leather boots, every unprotected inch of skin. Sergeant Karl Müller, huddled inside the shattered hull of a Panzer III, trying futilely to shield his fingers from the frost that gnawed at them like invisible teeth. The fuel lines had frozen overnight, leaving the engines dead and the tracks useless. Mechanical failure was no longer an occasional inconvenience, it was a daily sentence. Around them, the battlefield had transformed. Snow, once a soft blanket, had become a cruel adversary. Roads that had promised rapid advance now threatened to swallow men whole, hiding deep ruts, frozen mud, and the carcasses of equipment left behind by units that had pressed on too far too fast. Supply convoys, once the lifeblood of the Blitzkrieg, staggered in late, incomplete or not at all. Food ran low, Frostbitten soldiers gnawed at raw potatoes, hard biscuits, and whatever they could salvage from abandoned stores. Hoth rode past a column of infantry, noting the staggering gait, the hollow-eyed stares, the frozen beard. "They are not men anymore," he muttered under his breath. "They are shadows, moving through a grave of white." A messenger ran up, nearly collapsing from exhaustion and cold. Reports were grim. Another division had lost half its vehicles to frozen engines. A convoy had been ambushed near Klin, leaving over 300 dead or captured. The myth of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, unstoppable, invincible, was already crumbling in yet the Soviet forces were adapting with terrifying efficiency. Small bands of soldiers dressed in thick sheepskin coats and fur hats struck German flanks and supply lines. They melted into the forests, leaving only the occasional echo of gunfire or the faint plume of smoke to mark their presence. Where German commanders had relied on speed and shock, the Red Army relied on patience, endurance, and the bitter, elemental power of winter. Hoth dismounted from his horse near a frozen stream, watching men try to thaw their rifles over small fires that barely produced warmth. Some cried silently, others cursed, their voices lost to the wind. And everywhere, the pervasive silence of the snow spoke louder than any artillery, a silence that held death and despair in equal measure. The general's mind returned to strategy, to maps and charts. He had studied relentless, but the lines, the arrows, the calculated distances, none of it mattered now. Winter had drawn a new map, one that ignored doctrine and disregarded valor. In its frozen geometry, the Germans were exposed, overextended, and vulnerable. Each day, the cold stole another soldier, another tank, another piece of machinery that Berlin had promised would carry them to victory. By nightfall, temperatures plunged below 40. Fingers blackened, toes hardened into ice, and men whispered prayers into the wind, wondering if anyone would remember them, or if they would simply vanish into the white abyss. Hoth retreated to a dugout, huddling over a small stove, and for the first time allowed himself to confront the truth he had been trying to ignore. The war as he knew it, the fast, triumphant war, was over. Section 3. The Siege Tightens. December 15th, 1941. Northern outskirts of Moscow. The line of advance at a standstill. The German army had ground to a halt. Snowdrifts rose like walls across the open fields, swallowing foxholes, vehicles, and anything that dared move. The once structured formations of panzer divisions now resembled scattered, broken lines of desperate men, each trying to find shelter from a sky that seemed determined to freeze them alive. Artillery pieces, coated in layers of ice, refused to fire reliably, their barrels contracting and cracking under the cold. Major Wilhelm Kruger walked the perimeter of his unit, his boots crunching over the crusted snow. Faces stared back at him, empty, frozen masks of men who had once been eager to conquer a city. He could see the subtle tremor in their hands, the stiffness of joints, the hopelessness in eyes that had seen too much death, too quickly. Words of encouragement fell flat, swallowed by the wind. Orders became whispers, and whispers became meaningless against the omnipresent roar of the winter. Supply lines were obliterated. Trucks sank into icy mud. Horses froze to death in their harnesses, and food and ammunition arrived in fragments, if at all. Soldiers scavenged from abandoned depots, fighting over tinned meat, stale bread, and any remnants of fuel that might restart an engine. Morale, once a cornerstone of German strength, was now as brittle as the ice under their boots. The Red Army, in contrast, thrived. Soviet soldiers moved with quiet purpose through the forests, using sleds to transport artillery and supplies. They wore heavy fur coats and boots lined with felt, their faces partially covered with scarves to protect against frostbite. Ambushes became common. German soldiers would round a bend in the road only to find a field of snow shattered by sniper fire, frozen blood seeping into the ice. Hoth rode along the front lines, noting the increasing signs of collapse. The myth of German supremacy, the invincible Blitzkrieg, was no more than a fading echo, drowned out by the grinding, relentless hand of winter. "We are prisoners," he whispered to himself, not of the Soviets, but of the cold itself. He watched men digging shallow trenches with frozen hands, snow whipping into their faces, the effort monumental yet futile. Night fell swiftly, enveloping the battlefield in near total darkness. Fires flared briefly, as men tried to heat themselves, but they consumed precious wood and left smoke trails for the Soviets to spot. Howling wind made the air almost unbreathable, and frostbite crept silently, claiming soldiers as easily as bullets did. Hoth retreated to his command post in an abandoned farmhouse, walls thick with frost. As he spread out the maps under the flickering light of an oil lamp, he calculated distances, considered maneuvers, yet the numbers mocked him. No strategy could overcome temperatures that immobilized men and machines alike. The reality of the situation struck him fully. Moscow was not just defended, it was fortified by nature itself. And in this brutal environment, the German army's strength, pride, and illusion of invincibility were melting away like ice in a fire. Section 4, Starvation and Desperation. December 20th, 1941. The outskirts of Mobilsk, west of Moscow. Hunger had become as deadly as the frost. Soldiers tore into rations with trembling hands, the meager portions barely thawed, cold to the teeth and stomach alike. Packs of men scavenged abandoned Soviet villages, pulling apart frozen carcasses of horses, dogs, and whatever provisions remained. Those too weak to move were left behind, a grim testament to the relentless attrition. Corporal Friedrich Weber, huddled against a tree, trying to force a bite of hard bread into his mouth. His fingers were swollen and blackened from frostbite. His boots were shredded, exposing his toes to the icy ground. Around him, the groans of the dying mingled with the whispering wind. Soldiers whispered warnings of cannibalism, though no one acted on it yet. A line still clung to some sense of discipline, but the erosion of humanity was unmistakable. Hoth rode through the snow-blanketed fields, his horse struggling through icy rut. He observed columns of men staggering forward, faces hollow, uniforms tattered, and rifles dragging through the snow. Starvation had dulled their movements, slowed reactions, and eroded morale. Even officers could feel it, the rigid chain of command, fraying under the combined weight of hunger, cold, and fatigue. Supply trucks that had managed to arrive were nearly empty. Ammunition was rationed, food packets distributed sparingly. A single loaf of bread might be shared among 5 men. Coffee and sugar, once luxuries, were hoarded in the pockets of commanders. The Germans had always prided themselves on organization, on discipline, but winter did not respect such rules. It punished the meticulous and rewarded patience, endurance, and improvisation. The Red Army exploited every weakness. Soviet soldiers, nourished and acclimated, struck with surgical precision. They attacked supply lines, ambushed isolated units, and then disappeared into the forests and villages. The frozen terrain, once thought to hinder movement, became an ally to the defenders, channeling the Germans into predictable paths, where snipers and artillery waited. Hoth's mind, once consumed with strategy and victory, now circled obsessively around logistics, fuel, food, ammunition. He understood that victory in Moscow was no longer a question of tactics, it was a question of survival. And with each passing day, survival grew more tenuous. Men whispered about frostbite, death in the snow, and the horror of being left behind. Night brought no temperatures plunged even further, tents and dugouts offering only marginal protection. Frostbite was rampant. Soldiers awoke with blackened extremities, eyes swollen, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Fires burned low, smoke blending with the drifting snow, signaling presence to enemy scouts, while doing little to stave off the cold. Hoth's command post, once a place of strategy and orders, became a hub of despair. Reports of entire companies lost to frost or starvation arrived hourly, and as he looked out at the ghostly silhouettes of his men against the pale, unforgiving landscape, the German general realized the bitter truth. The Russian winter was not just a season, it was a weapon, and it had already begun to carve a path through his army, a path toward annihilation. Section 5. Machinery frozen. Morale shattered. December 25th, 1941. The frozen roads leading into the Moscow suburbs. The panzers were dead. Tanks that had once thundered across Europe, feared and unstoppable, now sat immobilized in fields of ice and snow. Lubricants congealed into waxy sludge. Engines cracked under the strain of sub-zero temperatures. Crews tried in vain to coax life from the metal beasts, prying at frozen hatches and spraying fuel additives, but the machines refused to obey. One by one, vehicles were abandoned, left to sink slowly into the frost-bitten earth. Their guns pointed uselessly toward the city they would never reach. Hoth rode past a column of Panzer IVs, their barrels encased in thick frost, tracks immobile. Soldiers stood around, faces grim, hands blue and swollen, staring at their frozen comrades with a mixture of disbelief and despair. Radios were silent or malfunctioning. Messages could not get through. The army that had prided itself on speed, coordination, and technological superiority was rendered impotent by the simplest force of nature. Everywhere exhaustion and frostbite eroded discipline. Orders went unheeded, units fragmented, and the chain of command strained under the pressure. Men argued over the last scraps of food and the few remaining blankets. Some wandered off, lost in the blinding snow, only to vanish into the white expanse. The few who returned were often delirious, hallucinating in the frozen darkness. The Soviet defenders, in stark contrast, were moving methodically, capitalizing on the Germans' vulnerability. Small partisan-like groups struck at supply convoys, ambushed isolated units, and vanished before counterattacks could be mounted. Each encounter left German soldiers demoralized, knowing that they were fighting not just an enemy, but a relentless environment that punished every mistake. Hoth convened a council with his senior officers in a frozen barn, walls thick with frost. The conversation was grim. Reports of entire divisions immobilized by snow and ice filled the room. Hunger, frostbite, and disease were decimating men faster than Soviet bullets. The general felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Knowing that each day brought more losses, he realized that Moscow was no longer a city to be conquered. It was a tomb for his army if they continued. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the faint echo of distant artillery and the muffled cries of men struggling against death. Hoth stared out through the frost-encrusted window, thinking of Berlin, of the promises made by Hitler and the generals, of the myth of Blitzkrieg that had once burned so brightly. That myth was now buried beneath the snow, and with it the illusion of victory. The winter had claimed the machinery, shattered morale, and forced the German army into a desperate fight for survival. Hoth understood, with chilling clarity, that this was no longer a tactical setback. It was a turning point. The war, as the German generals had envisioned it, was slipping irreversibly away, like water through frozen fingers, impossible to grasp, impossible to control. Section 6. The Human Cost. December 30th, 1941. The fields surrounding Krasnaya Polyana, west of Moscow. Corpses lay partially buried in the snow, frozen into grotesque positions, their faces locked in silent screams. The cold had claimed more lives than bullets, artillery, or men who had marched confidently toward Moscow just weeks earlier were now shadows of themselves, gaunt, frostbitten, and broken in spirit. The very act of moving forward had become an ordeal measured in inches, each step a struggle against icy boots, numbed muscles, and collapsing willpower. Private Heinz Bauer stumbled through the snow, clutching his rifle for balance, his breath a visible cloud of desperation. Food had dwindled to hardtack and frozen potatoes, fuel to ignite fires, for warmth was nearly gone, and morale had plummeted to the lowest Hoth had ever witnessed. Soldiers whispered of comrades left behind, of frozen corpses discovered in foxholes, of frostbite so severe it required amputation. Yet even that help was scarce. Medical posts were overwhelmed. Doctors and medics did what they could with the limited supplies on hand, bandaging frostbitten limbs with torn fabric, administering what little food could revive a fading soldier. Many, however, slipped away quietly in the night, curling up in the snow, succumbing to hypothermia before anyone could notice. Hoth himself walked the lines at dawn, observing the toll of the first real weeks of winter. He saw men praying over small personal relics, letters from home clutched tightly in frozen fingers, soldiers staring blankly into the whiteness, waiting for relief that never came. The German army, which had once inspired awe across Europe for its efficiency and discipline, now resembled a shattered relic, ground down by the most elemental forces imaginable. Reports reached him of desertions, of men abandoning positions in search of warmth, of small units being overrun or lost in the forests. Each tale, each body, each frozen expression chipped away at the hope that victory was still within reach. Even the officers, hardened by years of combat, admitted privately that the Russian winter was not merely a natural obstacle, it was an annihilator, impartial and absolute. The Soviets, acclimated and organized, continued their methodical resistance. They had learned the terrain, adapted to the cold, and struck at German weaknesses with precision. For every man that Hoth could muster, the Soviets had a counter, a tactic, a shield against the frozen onslaught. Their resilience was demoralizing, a constant reminder that Moscow was not simply defended, it was fortified by climate, geography, and sheer human endurance. That evening, as darkness fell, Hoth retreated to his command post once more, exhausted and haunted. The wind outside seemed louder than any artillery, louder than any cry of command. He knew the cost of this winter would be measured, not only in lost ground, but in human lives, shattered morale, and the irreversible erosion of the army's fighting capacity. The German advance had stalled, its momentum destroyed, and with it, the illusion that victory was inevitable. Hoth finally admitted the truth to himself, unspoken but undeniable. The war for Moscow was no longer winnable. Every step forward would be paid for in lives, machinery, and hope. And the winter, relentless and indifferent, would ensure that the cost was devastatingly high. Section 7. The Collapse of Blitzkrieg. January 4th, 1942. The frozen outskirts of Moscow. The myth of Blitzkrieg had been shattered, not by superior firepower or cunning strategy, but by the inexorable hand of winter. The German army, once a tidal wave of armored steel and coordinated infantry, had become a disjointed mass of men and machines, immobilized and vulnerable. Orders from Berlin arrived sporadically, their confident tones now hollow echoes over crackling, snow-drowned radios. Hoth surveyed the battlefield from a small rise. In the distance, columns of infantry trudged through the snow, dragging artillery that refused to move, carrying supplies that had long been depleted. Panzer divisions were reduced to skeleton crews, their vehicles silent monuments to a war machine frozen in place. The air was thick with the metallic tang of fuel mixed with the scent of human suffering, a combination that clung to the nose and mind alike. Officers attempted to maintain discipline, shouting commands into the wind, but the cold stole their voices as quickly as it stole men. Soldiers struggled to ignite flares, to clear frozen weapons, to even lift their rifles. Discipline gave way to desperation. Desperation gave way to chaos. The carefully constructed machinery of the Blitzkrieg, the coordination of tanks, infantry, and air support, had collapsed under a force no one had accounted for: the Russian winter. Soviet forces, moving methodically and with intimate knowledge of the terrain, struck relentlessly. Snow-covered forests hid snipers. Frozen rivers funneled German units into predictable paths, where ambushes waited. The German army, trained for speed and precision, was now a lumbering, predictable target. Each engagement was costly, each skirmish a reminder that Moscow would not fall by force of arms alone. Hoth's mind was a storm of calculation and despair. How had they underestimated the cold so completely? How had the army, which had swept across Europe with terrifying efficiency, allowed itself to become a victim of frost, starvation, and exhaustion? The answers were painfully clear: arrogance, overconfidence, and a fundamental underestimation of the Russian landscape and climate. By nightfall, the front lines were punctuated with the flickering lights of frozen fires, each one a desperate attempt to stave off hypothermia. The soldiers huddled close, whispering prayers or crying silently, knowing that survival was no longer guaranteed. Hoth returned to his command post, the maps spread before him now meaningless. The Blitzkrieg was dead, and with it, the illusion that Germany could achieve a swift victory over the Soviet Union. As he stared out at the ghostly silhouettes of his men, he understood the full weight of the winter's message. Speed, power, and confidence were meaningless against frost that froze hands, hearts, and hope. Moscow would not be taken this year, perhaps not ever, and the war, once a stage for German dominance, had entered a brutal new reality, one in which the enemy was as much the winter itself as the Red Army defending the city. Section 8. Retreat and Reflection. The frozen forests west of Moscow. Hoth's orders were finally clear: hold what could be held, prepare for retreat where necessary. The German advance had ground to a halt, and the winter had transformed from obstacle to executioner. Vehicles remained frozen, rifles jammed, and men moved with the sluggishness of the frostbitten. Every step forward had become a gamble with death. The retreat was chaotic. Columns of soldiers staggered along snow-choked roads, dragging sleds of abandoned equipment, leaving behind tanks too heavy to move, ammunition caches too frozen to transport. The once pristine order of the German army had dissolved into a procession of exhaustion, fear. Some units vanished into the blizzards, lost without trace, while others arrived at temporary positions only to find entire supply stocks frozen or destroyed. Hoth rode ahead of the main column, observing the human toll. Men had frostbitten faces, their beards crusted with ice, eyes hollow and staring, voices barely audible over the howl of the wind. He saw soldiers collapse, unable to continue, only to be buried hastily in shallow graves dug into the frozen earth. The retreat was not a tactical maneuver. It was a fight for survival, and every hour claimed lives. Messages from Berlin grew increasingly frantic, urging continued offensives. Yet Hoth understood the futility. The German army could not function in this climate, could not maintain cohesion, and could not advance. The strategic initiative had been lost, not to Soviet brilliance, but to the unyielding, merciless power of winter. As he paused to check the progress of his units, Hoth reflected on the cost of arrogance. The myth of Blitzkrieg had promised rapid victory, glory, and the swift subjugation of the Soviet Union. Instead, the army faced hunger, frostbite, mechanical failure, and relentless Soviet counterattack. Nature itself had become a weapon, one that Germany was ill-prepared to counter. By night, the retreating forces set up makeshift camps along frozen streams and wind-swept clearings. Fires burned low, and soldiers huddled together for warmth. Hoth entered his command post, now nothing more than a frozen farmhouse stripped bare by necessity. The maps lay before him, but their lines and arrows no longer represented a path to victory. They were records of a march halted, a war stalled, and an army battered by forces beyond comprehension. He knew with a clarity that chilled him as much as the weather, that the German hopes of capturing Moscow had been crushed. The myth of Blitzkrieg, the pride of an army, and the confidence of generals all lay buried under snow, ice, and human suffering. And as the wind rattled through the broken windows, Hoth understood the bitter truth. The war on the Eastern Front would be long, brutal, and defined not by speed or strategy, but by endurance, attrition, and the unforgiving hand of winter. Section 9. The Soviet Counteroffensive, January 15th, 1942. The battered German lines near Moscow. The Red Army struck with precision and vigor that the frozen German forces could no longer resist. Freshly supplied, acclimated, and resolute, Soviet divisions advanced in waves, exploiting every weakness that winter had exposed. Snow-choked roads funneled German units into predictable paths where artillery and infantry waited, hidden in forests and villages. Every ambush further eroded morale. Every successful Soviet maneuver a reminder of the futility of the German effort. Hoth watched from a ridge as columns of Soviet troops, clad in heavy fur coats and armed with rifles and Molotov cocktails, surged forward. Their movements were coordinated, efficient, and terrifyingly calm against the backdrop of chaos among the Germans. The Germans' frozen artillery roared sporadically, but most pieces failed to fire, their barrels warped or seized by ice. The panzers that had survived the cold were few, and many had crews too exhausted or frostbitten to operate them effectively. In the trenches, soldiers whispered of Soviet numbers, of reinforcements that seemed endless, and of the bitter cold that had left them weakened and vulnerable. Desperation mounted as units became isolated, their supply lines severed, and their comrades disappearing into the white expanse. Hoth rode along the front, trying to rally his men, but the eyes that met his were empty. Confidence had frozen along with fingers and toes, leaving only survival instinct in its place. By nightfall, entire German positions had been overrun, forced to retreat under heavy pressure. Fires from burning supply depots cast flickering shadows across the snow, illuminating the chaos and exhaustion etched into every face. Soldiers clutched what little they could carry: rifles, small packs of food, fragments of ammunition, while leaving behind everything else to the cold and the advancing Soviets. Hoth's thoughts returned to Berlin. The directives of his superiors, once confident in the Blitzkrieg, now rang hollow against the reality of the battlefield. Winter had turned German planning into folly, turning strategy into survival. Moscow remained unconquered, a fortress of ice, snow, and unyielding defense. And as he watched the Soviets reclaim ground, the grim reality sank in. The tide of the war had shifted irreversibly. The counteroffensive was not merely a military maneuver, it was a message. The myth of German invincibility, so carefully constructed over years of swift victories, lay in ruins. Hoth understood that the war was no longer about bold advances or quick victories. It was about endurance, attrition, and learning to fight an enemy far more prepared for the merciless environment of the East. Section 10. The General's Realization, January 20th. A wind-swept ridge overlooking the Moscow front. Hoth dismounted from his horse, his fur-lined coat soaked with melting snow and sweat, and stared down at the battlefield that had once promised triumph. The German lines were shattered, the frozen earth littered with abandoned tanks, weapons, and the silent bodies of men who had succumbed to frostbite, hunger, or enemy fire. He inhaled sharply, the icy air burning his lungs, and felt a bitter truth settle over him like the snow that never ceased to fall. The war in the East was lost, not entirely, not yet, but the momentum, the illusion, the invincibility, all were gone. Everywhere he looked, the consequences of underestimating winter were visible. Soldiers moved like ghosts, some barely able to hold their rifles, others whispering prayers into the wind. Supply convoys, once arteries of victory, were frozen or destroyed. Panzers that had roared through Europe now sat silent, entombed in ice. Even the air support, which had once given German forces unmatched mobility, struggled against the frigid, gray sky. Hoth's mind replayed the past weeks, the overconfidence in Berlin, the hubris that believed Moscow could be taken swiftly, the unpreparedness for temperatures that reached 40 degrees below zero. Every decision, every plan, every order now seemed naive in hindsight, and yet he did not despair entirely. He understood that survival required cold clarity, not hope. Retreat would be necessary, but it had to be calculated. The Soviet counteroffensive was relentless, and missteps would cost more than men. They would cost entire units, perhaps the entire army's operational capability in the region. He dismounted fully, walking along the ridge, scanning the snow-covered field. The Soviets were advancing again, methodical, relentless, impervious to the cold. Hoth realized that the myth of German invincibility, the Blitzkrieg, was not merely a tactical concept, but a psychological weapon, one now destroyed by frost, snow, and Soviet endurance. Moscow was more than a city. It was a symbol of what the Germans could not achieve under these conditions. As the sun dipped low behind clouds heavy with snow, Hoth stood silently, the wind lashing against his face. He felt the weight of command, the burden of responsibility for thousands of men who were now vulnerable to the cold as much as to bullets. In that moment, he saw the stark reality. The war was no longer predictable, no longer guided by plans or doctrine. It had become a test of resilience, a brutal campaign against men, machines, and the indifferent power of nature itself. For the first time, Hermann Hoth admitted it fully, to himself if to no one else. The German army had underestimated winter, underestimated Russia, underestimated the human and natural forces arrayed against them. The siege of Moscow was failing. The myth of Blitzkrieg was dead. And in that freezing landscape where the snow stretched endlessly and the wind howled like a living enemy, he knew that Germany's Eastern campaign had entered a long, bitter decline from which it might never recover. Section 11. Winter's Judgment. January 25th, 1942. The shattered outskirts of Moscow. Frozen fields stretching into the horizon. Hoth stood atop a small ridge, watching the smoke of burning supply depots curl into the grey sky. The once confident roar of German armored divisions had been replaced by the muffled crunch of snow beneath exhausted boots and the distant echo of Soviet artillery. Every step forward had become a gamble. Every maneuver was met with resistance, not just from men, but from the frozen land itself. The cost of the campaign was staggering. Entire divisions had been immobilized, tanks lost to frozen engines, artillery pieces cracked or abandoned. Soldiers were dying by the hundreds each day, not from gunfire but from hypothermia, frostbite, and starvation. Hoth could feel it in his bones. The winter was exacting its judgment, impartial and relentless. This was not a temporary setback. It was a catastrophic reckoning. Reports from his officers were grim. Units were scattered, supply lines irreparably damaged, and the men's morale had plummeted to its lowest point. Even the most disciplined troops moved with the sluggishness of exhaustion and cold. Hoth understood that the German army could no longer operate as it had in Poland, France, or the early months of Operation Barbarossa. The speed, coordination, and shock tactics that had defined Blitzkrieg were impossible in a landscape that demanded endurance and patience over aggression. He turned his gaze toward Moscow itself, barely visible through the grey haze of snow and smoke. The city had not fallen, and it would not fall. Not now, not in the foreseeable future. The Soviet defenders were organized, acclimated, and resilient, exploiting every weakness in the German advance and every vulnerability that winter had revealed. Hoth's reflection was interrupted by the sound of a distant artillery shell exploding in the snow, sending shards of ice and earth into the air. A soldier collapsed nearby, shivering uncontrollably, his breath visible in ragged clouds. Hoth moved to assist him, but the harsh truth was evident. There was simply too many suffering, too many injured, too many dying. Survival was now the only objective, and even that was uncertain. That evening, As the wind howled outside and the last light of day faded, Hoth wrote his report. There were no boasts, no confident projections, only a stark acknowledgement of reality. The German advance had been halted, the army was weakened beyond its commander's reckoning, and the Russian winter had claimed both men and machinery with ruthless efficiency. Hoth knew that Berlin would demand explanations, reassurances, and continued offensive, but he also knew that no amount of planning or hope could undo the lessons carved into the frozen earth west of Moscow. The Eastern Front was no longer a battlefield of rapid victories, but a crucible of endurance, where nature itself was the deadliest adversary. The German army had marched into Russia with hubris and ambition, believing that speed, firepower, and courage would be enough. They had been proven wrong. The winter had arrived, merciless and absolute, and in its icy grip, Hoth and his men understood a terrifying truth. The war in the East was far from over, but it had already been irrevocably changed, and not in Germany's favor. Section 12. Acceptance and Survival. February. Western approaches to Moscow, a wasteland of ice and snow. The German army was no longer advancing. It was surviving. Hoth moved along the battered lines, observing men who trudged forward, not with ambition, but with sheer determination to endure another day. Frostbitten fingers clutched rifles that were often useless, boots crunched through frozen mud, and every breath was a visible struggle against the merciless cold. The fighting spirit that had carried them across Europe had been reduced to a thin thread of resilience. Supply shortages persisted, food was rationed to bare minimums, ammunition hoarded for emergencies, and fuel nearly non-existent. Soldiers scavenged what they could from abandoned vehicles and depots, chewing on frozen rations, sharing scraps, and igniting tiny fires for warmth that threatened to draw enemy attention. Even officers felt the sting of deprivation. No one was spared the reach of the winter. Hoth convened his remaining senior officers in a half-frozen barn. Maps were spread across a snow-dusted table, but the arrows and lines meant little. Plans of conquest had been replaced by strategies of survival. "Our goal is endurance," Hoth said, voice low and steady despite exhaustion. "Hold positions where possible. Protect what remains. Retreat only when necessary. Each day we survive is a day Berlin cannot ignore our losses." Around them, the landscape was a testament to attrition. Frozen corpses dotted the snow fields. Abandoned equipment glinted under the pale sun, and the faint sounds of distant Soviet patrols served as a constant reminder of the perils surrounding them. Every man was tested, every machine strained, and the harsh reality of winter demanded more than courage. It demanded adaptation. Hoth walked among the soldiers, offering what words of encouragement he could, but he understood the limits of leadership in a frozen war. Orders could not thaw frostbitten limbs, supply chains could not conjure fuel from ice, and morale alone could not fill empty stomachs. The battle for survival had become as vital as any strategic objective. By nightfall, fires flickered weakly across the encampments. Men huddled close to stave off frostbite, and Hoth reviewed his reports in solitude. The brutal lesson was clear. The myth of Blitzkrieg, the invincibility of German arms, the promise of swift victory, all had been shattered by the Russian winter. Moscow remained unconquered, the army battered, and the campaign's momentum irretrievably lost. And yet, amidst the despair, a glimmer remained. Survival. Hoth recognized that while the winter had exacted a devastating toll, endurance and careful planning could preserve what remained of the army for future operations. It was a bitter realization, tempered by the knowledge that survival alone was no longer glory, but it was all that could be hoped for under the icy hand of Russia. Section 13. The Turning Point. February 10th, 1942. The battered German positions west of Moscow. The Red Army, sensing the weakening German lines, began to consolidate its strength. Fresh troops, well-fed and acclimated, moved steadily toward the front, supported by artillery that fired with devastating precision. The Germans, exhausted and frostbitten, could only hold defensive positions, their once feared panzers mostly immobilized, and their infantry struggling to survive in the snow-choked landscape. Hoth observed the situation with grim clarity. The initiative was lost. Blitzkrieg, the strategy that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe with terrifying speed and efficiency, had collapsed under the relentless Russian winter. What remained was a grueling attritional struggle, where victory was measured, not in captured cities, but in the survival of men and machinery, against the elements and an increasingly organized enemy. Reports from the front lines painted a dire picture. Supply convoys were still intermittently frozen or destroyed, units were scattered, and the sick and frostbitten outnumbered the able-bodied. Soldiers whispered rumors of entire companies lost to frostbite and starvation, of comrades disappearing into blizzards, and of the relentless Soviet push. The psychological toll was as lethal as the physical. Hoth convened a meeting with his senior staff in a small, partially frozen farmhouse. Maps and reports littered the table, but strategy had given way to reality. "We cannot advance," he said, his voice carrying the weight of recognition. "Our strength is spent. The enemy is prepared. The winter has become our deadliest adversary. Our goal now is preservation, not conquest." Outside, the wind howled, carrying snow into every crevice and creaking along the frozen trees. Soldiers huddled in makeshift shelters, exchanging minimal words, conserving energy, and praying for survival. The Russian winter had become the dominant force on the battlefield, dictating movement, strategy, and the very limits of human endurance. Hoth walked along the lines, observing the broken men and machines. The scale of destruction was staggering. Tanks frozen in place, horses dead from exposure, and trenches filled with ice and snow. The German army that had once struck fear across Europe was now a shadow of itself, held together by discipline, stubbornness, and the sheer will to survive. For the first time, Hoth fully understood the implications of the winter. Moscow would not fall quickly, perhaps not at all. The myth of Blitzkrieg had been shattered, replaced by the cold, harsh reality of attrition, endurance, and the overwhelming power of nature. The Eastern Front had become a crucible, and the German army's fate would be determined as much by the frostbitten hand of winter as by the Red Army itself. Section 14. Lessons etched in ice. February 20th, 1942. Western approaches to Moscow. Under a grey, frozen sky, Hoth rode slowly along the remnants of his lines, each step revealing the cost of overconfidence. Soldiers trudged past him, their boots shredded, fingers blackened by frostbite, faces hollowed by hunger and exhaustion. Even the officers, once symbols of discipline and authority, moved with a weariness that bespoke the relentless attrition of the past 2 months. The German army had learned, painfully, that speed and firepower were useless against the Russian winter. Blitzkrieg had promised rapid victory, but the cold did not respect doctrine or confidence. It froze fuel lines, immobilized tanks, and stole the lives of men faster than bullets ever could. Moscow had not fallen, and the Wehrmacht's advance was no longer a story of triumph. It was a tale of endurance, suffering, and bitter humility. Hoth paused by an abandoned supply depot, surveying frozen crates of food, ammunition, and equipment. Soldiers scavenged what they could, gnawing at bread hard as rock, trying to coax warmth from their frostbitten hands. He realized that victory in Russia would require more than tactics. It demanded preparation, adaptation, and respect for a landscape and climate that could destroy an army as efficiently as the Red Army itself. Conversations with his officers were sober. Units were reorganized, supply lines rerouted, and defensive positions reinforced. Survival became the primary objective. The men would not march forward until they had been fed, warmed, and rested, basic necessities that had been long neglected in the drive toward Moscow. The lessons were harsh, but unavoidable. The Eastern Front was not a battlefield of quick victories, but a test of endurance, strategy, and humility. Hoth reflected on the human cost. Frostbite, starvation, disease, and relentless Soviet attacks had claimed thousands. The psychological toll was equally severe.
Men whispered of comrades lost to the snow, of entire companies swallowed by blizzards, of the hopelessness of fighting against both man and nature. The army that had once swept across Europe with terrifying speed was now humbled, reshaped by the cruel hands of winter. As night fell, fires flickered weakly across the camps, the wind rattling frozen shutters and drifting through makeshift shelter. Hoth returned to his command post, surveying the battlefield. One last time before night fully set in, the snow stretched endlessly, unbroken and indifferent, a stark reminder of the forces arrayed against. In that frozen silence, Hoth understood the bitter truth. The German advance had failed, not through lack of skill, courage or planning, but because winter, indifferent and absolute, had claimed the battlefield. Moscow had resisted. The myth of Blitzkrieg was destroyed, replaced by a lesson etched in ice, snow and human suffering. Victory in Russia would never be swift, easy or certain.
Section 15. The Bitter Realization. February 28, 1942. The frozen ridges west of Moscow. Hoth stood alone for a moment, staring across the endless white wasteland that had become the Eastern Front. The German army, once celebrated for its lightning campaigns, now huddled in makeshift camps, scattered across snow-choked fields. The wind tore at his coat and burned his exposed cheeks, yet it could not match the cold truth that had settled in his mind. The war in the East had changed irrevocably, and Germany's hope of a quick victory was over. Reports filtered in hourly, each one reinforcing the harsh reality. Soviet forces were regrouping, preparing for continued operations, while the Germans struggled to salvage what remained of their once formidable strength. Men were frostbitten, hungry, and demoralized. Tanks were immobile, artillery frozen, and supply lines fragmented. The battlefield no longer responded to strategy or ambition. It responded only to endurance and preparation. Hoth knew that his army could no longer claim the initiative. Every decision was now defensive, aimed at survival rather than conquest. Moscow would not fall this winter. Perhaps it would not fall at all. The hubris that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe had been shattered by something they had underestimated completely: nature. The Russian winter had proven as formidable an enemy as the Red Army, and in many ways more unforgiving. He walked among his men, offering what words of comfort he could, though he knew they carried little weight. The soldiers' eyes, hollow from weeks of cold and hunger, reflected the truth he had finally admitted to himself. Germany's advance was over. Survival, not victory, was the only objective. Each day lived, each frostbitten hand preserved, was now counted as a minor triumph. That night, Hoth returned to his command post, the dim light of a single lantern, casting long shadows across maps frozen with ice crystals. He sat quietly, contemplating the cost. Thousands of men lost to frostbite and starvation, entire divisions immobilized, and the illusion of Blitzkrieg destroyed forever. In that silence, surrounded by the harsh winter that had humbled his army, he accepted the bitter reality. The Eastern Front had claimed its victory, and Germany had paid dearly in both blood and pride. The war was far from over, but the lesson was clear and unforgettable. In Russia, winter was as lethal as any army, and survival required far more than courage, discipline, or strategy. It demanded respect for the land, adaptation to its fury, and the humility to recognize that even the most formidable forces could be rendered powerless by ice, snow, and the relentless passage of time. Section 16. Endurance over ambition. March 5, 1942. The frozen forests west of Moscow. The first faint signs of thaw had begun, but they brought little relief. The snow was softer, the ice cracking beneath tired boots, yet the damage of the winter remained. Hoth rode slowly along the German positions, noting the men who had survived, their movements still sluggish, faces lined with exhaustion and frostbite. Victory was no longer measured in captured territory, but in endurance,
simply making it through another day. Supplies remained perilously low. Rations were meager, and every effort to transport ammunition and fuel was hampered by the remnants of frozen roads and destroyed infrastructure. Soldiers scavenged the few remaining depots and abandoned positions, sharing scraps and makeshift warmth. The army's discipline, though frayed, was held together by necessity rather than morale, each man clinging to the fragile hope of survival. Hoth convened a council with his senior officers. The discussion was pragmatic, stripped of ambition. Offensive maneuvers were deferred indefinitely. Defensive positions were reinforced. Retreat routes were mapped with precision, ensuring that if the Soviet counterattacks escalated, the army could withdraw without total annihilation. Survival, adaptation, and careful resource management were the new doctrine. The Soviet forces remained vigilant, their winter-hardened units probing, testing, and striking whenever an opening appeared. Hoth observed them from a ridge, disciplined, methodical, and relentless, moving like shadows across the snow. The German soldiers, once masters of rapid warfare, now learned to respect patience, endurance, and strategy honed in harsh conditions. At night, Hoth returned to his frozen command post, reviewing maps and reports. He understood that the lessons of Moscow were permanent. The myth of Blitzkrieg had been destroyed not by superior tactics alone, but by a force beyond planning. Winter itself, nature, indifferent and absolute, had humbled the Wehrmacht. Berlin's hubris had collided with reality, and the army had paid a terrible price. Hoth's final reflection that evening was both bitter and sober. Germany could not ignore the lessons of this winter. Ambition had given way to endurance, speed to patience, and myth to reality. The Eastern Front would continue, the struggle against the Red Army, unrelenting. But now the army had been forced to recognize that survival, simple, relentless, and unglamorous, was the foundation for any future operation.
Section 17. A General's Reckoning. March 12, 1942. Western approaches to Moscow, where the snow had begun to soften, but the cold remained biting. Hoth walked through the remnants of his forces, the men moving slowly, faces pale, hands blackened from frostbite. Equipment was salvaged where possible, but much had been lost forever. Tanks abandoned in ice, artillery pieces left behind, rifles frozen or broken. The German army, once a lightning force that struck terror across Europe, now resembled a shadow of its former self, bound together by discipline and sheer will rather than confidence or ambition. The soldiers whispered among themselves, telling tales of comrades lost to frostbite, of skirmishes where survival was victory, and of the relentless winter that had spared no one. Hoth listened quietly, understanding that the war had become as much a struggle against nature as against the Red Army. Every decision was weighted by the need to preserve what remained, rather than to achieve glory. Reports from the front continued to arrive, Soviet forces probing, advancing in some sectors, consolidating in others. The Germans held positions where possible, but avoided unnecessary engagement. Hoth knew that any offensive was impossible until men, machines, and supplies could recover from the harshest winter in decades. Moscow remained unconquered, its streets and suburbs held by defenders strengthened by both preparation and the bitter climate. Hoth paused on a ridge overlooking the battlefield, snow drifting endlessly across the frozen fields. He reflected on the hubris of Berlin, on the belief that Germany could march unopposed to Moscow and secure a decisive victory. The myth of Blitzkrieg had been shattered by frost and snow, by hunger and exhaustion, and by the disciplined patience of the Soviet defenders. In the quiet, he finally allowed himself to articulate the truth he had known for weeks. The war in the East had entered a new phase. It was no longer defined by speed or lightning strikes, but by endurance, adaptation, and the ability to survive. The German army had been humbled, and its commanders were forced to recognize the limits of their power in a land dominated by winter. Hoth returned to his command post that evening, the wind howling through the frozen ruins of a once active headquarters. As he spread maps across the frost-laden table, he understood
that the lessons of this campaign would be remembered in blood and ice. The Eastern Front had tested men, machines, and morale to their limits, and only those who adapted could hope to endure. The war was far from over, but the myth of German invincibility, the Blitzkrieg, was dead. In its place was a sobering reality: survival, careful planning, and respect for the relentless forces of nature were now the keys to enduring the long, bitter struggle ahead. Section 18. The Winter's Legacy. The outskirts of Moscow, where the thawing snow revealed the grim toll of months spent under winter's grip, Hoth surveyed the landscape, now littered with the frozen remnants of an army that had once struck fear across Europe. Tanks and artillery, abandoned in the snow, glinted dully under a pale sun. Trenches were half filled with ice and mud, and bodies, both German and Soviet, lay where the winter had left them. The battlefield bore silent witness to the devastating power of the cold, a force that had humbled generals, decimated divisions, and shattered illusions. The soldiers, those who had survived, moved cautiously through the melting snow, scavenging what remained, and tending to the frostbite. Their faces were etched with fatigue, their movements slower, their eyes carrying the memory of suffering. Hoth walked among them, offering words of encouragement that felt hollow even to himself. Survival, not victory, had become the measure of success. Hoth reflected on the lessons learned. The myth of Blitzkrieg had been destroyed, not by Soviet ingenuity alone, but by the harsh, indifferent winter that had immobilized men and machines alike. Strategy and speed had been rendered meaningless by frost, starvation, and relentless cold. The Eastern Front had taught a brutal lesson. In Russia, nature was as formidable as any army, and underestimating it carried a devastating cost. He considered the future. The army would need to rebuild, regroup, and equipment lost to the frost would need replacement. Supply lines would require careful planning. Men would have to recover from frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion. The war in the East had shifted from rapid conquest to a prolonged struggle of attrition, one where endurance, preparation, and respect for the environment were essential. As night fell, Hoth returned to his command post, the wind rustling through the broken window. Fires burned weakly across the encampments, illuminating the frozen faces of soldiers who had survived the harshest winter in decades. Hoth understood that while the myth of German invincibility had been destroyed, the army itself had not yet fallen. Survival had been achieved, but at a cost that would haunt the Wehrmacht for months to come. In the quiet of the night, he allowed himself to record the bitter truth. The winter had claimed more than men or machines. It had claimed illusions over confidence, and the arrogance that had fueled the German advance. Moscow remained unconquered, the army battered, but the lessons of frost and endurance would be carried forward. The Eastern Front had been transformed, and the war would never again be fought in ignorance of the power of nature.
Section 19. Reflections on Defeat and Survival. March 28, 1942. The battered German positions west of Moscow, where mud replaced ice, but the hardships of winter lingered. Hoth sat in the dimly lit command post, maps spread before him, and thought of the months gone by. The army that had marched so confidently toward Moscow was no longer the same force. Men were diminished in number, battered in spirit, and marked by frostbite and hunger. Tanks that had once inspired awe now lay abandoned, and artillery that had roared across Europe was silent, immobilized by ice and snow. The cost of ambition, compounded by nature's fury, was stark and unrelenting. Letters from officers filtered in, detailing small acts of endurance, soldiers sharing what little food remained, comrades carrying frostbitten men to safety, officers improvising repairs on frozen equipment. These were not victories in the traditional sense, but triumphs of survival. Hoth realized that the true measure of success in the East was no longer territory or speed. It was preservation of men and resources in the face of an environment that refused mercy. The Soviet forces had begun to consolidate gains, probing the German defenses with renewed energy. Hoth's men, though exhausted and diminished, resisted when possible, but he knew the long-term strategy had shifted. No longer could the Wehrmacht rely on rapid conquests or decisive offensives. Survival, cautious defense,
and adaptation with a new doctrine. Walking outside into the chill of the late Russian winter, Hoth observed the quiet devastation around him. Snow had melted in places, revealing churned-up earth, frozen corpses and abandoned vehicles. Each sight was a reminder of the relentless punishment exacted by frost, starvation and relentless combat. Moscow had not fallen, and the myth of German invincibility, the idea that Blitzkrieg could conquer Russia quickly, was destroyed beyond repair. That evening, Hoth wrote in his journal, not as a strategist plotting victory, but as a commander documenting lessons learned at enormous cost. The winter had proven that no army, however disciplined or technologically advanced, could ignore the forces of nature. The Eastern Front was no longer a theater for rapid conquest. It was a crucible, testing endurance, resilience, and the ability to adapt. Hoth closed the journal, the candle flickering against the frost-encrusted windows. The army had survived the winter, but the cost was staggering. Thousands lost, divisions weakened, equipment destroyed, and morale fractured. Yet in survival lay a fragile hope. The Wehrmacht could endure, regroup and fight another day, but only if it remembered the bitter lessons carved into the snow, ice, and blood of Moscow's outskirts. Section 20. The war forever changed. April 5, 1942. The slowly thawing plains west of Moscow. The sun cast weak light across a battlefield still scarred by months of frost and combat. Hoth rode along the remnants of his army, noting the scattered units, battered men and immobilized vehicles. The snow had begun to recede, revealing churned mud, frozen corpses and abandoned artillery. The landscape itself was a memorial to the winter that had humbled the Wehrmacht, a reminder that nature could be as deadly as any enemy army. Hoth understood the full scope of what had occurred. The campaign toward Moscow had failed, not through tactical errors alone, but through a combination of human overconfidence and a merciless Russian winter. Blitzkrieg, which had defined Germany's victories in Europe, had been shattered. The myth of rapid conquest was destroyed, replaced by the sobering reality that the Eastern Front would demand endurance, patience, and a respect for forces beyond human control. Soldiers trudged through the mud, faces pale, hands scarred by frostbite, carrying the remnants of what they could salvage. The cost had been staggering, tens of thousands lost to frostbite, starvation and battle, entire divisions reduced in effectiveness, and morale battered by the realization that their confidence had been misplaced. Survival, Hoth reflected, was the only victory they could claim. From his ridge, Hoth watched the distant smoke of burning supply depots and the movements of Soviet patrols. The enemy remained vigilant, disciplined and adapted. Hoth knew that the struggle was far from over, but the lessons of the winter were etched into the minds of every officer and soldier. Moscow could not be taken quickly. The climate was an enemy as deadly as any army, and arrogance had been punished with immense human and material loss. As the day faded, Hoth returned to his command post. Considering the months ahead, the Eastern Front had changed irrevocably. Success would no longer come from rapid offensives or overwhelming force alone. It would demand endurance, careful planning, and a humility born of suffering. The myth of German invincibility, the very essence of Blitzkrieg, had been destroyed by ice, snow and human endurance. In the quiet of the evening, with the wind still cutting across the thawing plains, Hoth reflected on the bitter truth that would define the remainder of the war. Nature could not be ignored, preparation could not be rushed, and the human cost of misjudgment was unthinkable. The Eastern Front had been transformed, and Germany's ambitions had been humbled. Survival, endurance, and respect for the relentless forces arrayed against them would now shape every decision, every movement, and every hope for victory.
Section 21. The Aftermath of Winter. April 12, 1942. The thawing outskirts of Moscow, where mud replaced snow, but the scars of winter remained. Hoth walked among his men, noting their injuries, exhaustion, and the haunted expressions etched on their faces. Some had lost fingers, toes, or limbs to frostbite. Others carried the weight of hunger and disease, Even the most disciplined units moved slower than before, their cohesion strained by months of attrition and relentless cold. Equipment was salvaged where possible, but much remained abandoned, irretrievably damaged by ice and snow. Reports continued to arrive from the front. Soviet forces were regrouping, cautious yet resolute, probing German positions and reclaiming ground where the Wehrmacht had been forced to retreat. Moscow itself remained firmly in Soviet hands, a testament to preparation, endurance, and the ability to withstand both man and nature. Hoth knew that the Eastern Front had become a war of attrition, far different from the rapid campaigns that had brought Germany victory across Europe. As he walked through a half-frozen supply depot, Hoth reflected on the lessons that the winter had enforced. Blitzkrieg, the strategy of speed and surprise that had defined the Wehrmacht, was no longer viable in Russia. Success now required adaptation, careful planning, and respect for forces beyond human control. Nature, indifferent and merciless, had humbled men and machines alike. The men huddled in camps, tending to frostbitten comrades, sharing meager rations, and scavenging what remained. Morale was fragile, but survival had forged a grim resilience. Hoth observed quietly, realizing that endurance, rather than ambition, was now the measure of the army's strength. In his command post, maps and reports covered the table, but the arrows and lines no longer represented swift victory. They were records of loss, hardship, and survival. The cost of the Russian winter was evident in every frozen ridge, abandoned vehicle, and scarred face. Hoth understood that the campaign had forever altered the nature of the Eastern Front. The winter had claimed more than men and equipment. It had claimed illusions, overconfidence, and the myth of German invincibility. Moscow had not fallen. The Wehrmacht had endured, but at a staggering cost. Hoth knew that the army could continue to fight, but only if it accepted the harsh reality that survival, adaptation, and respect for the elements were now as vital as strategy or firepower. Section 22. A General's Reckoning. April 20th, 1942. The slowly thawing fields west of Moscow. Hoth stood atop a small rise, looking across the battlefield that had tested men and machines alike. The frozen snow had begun to melt, revealing churned mud, abandoned tanks, and the scattered remnants of a campaign that had promised swift victory, but delivered bitter reality. The German army had endured, but the cost was monumental. Thousands of casualties, frostbitten soldiers, and divisions weakened beyond recognition. He reflected on the months of struggle, the initial overconfidence, and the hubris of Berlin. Blitzkrieg, the strategy that had carried Germany across Europe with devastating speed, had failed against the twin forces of Russian resilience and winter's fury. Moscow had not fallen, and the army's morale had been irreparably shaken. Hoth understood, with painful clarity, that the myth of German invincibility was gone. Walking among his men, Hoth saw the enduring human spirit. Soldiers scavenged for food, tended to the frostbitten, and worked tirelessly to salvage equipment. These acts were not victories in the traditional sense, but they were essential for survival. In Russia, survival had become the only attainable form of success. Every day lived, every frostbitten hand saved, and every soldier preserved for the future represented a small triumph against overwhelming odds. In his command post, Hoth reviewed reports and plans. Future operations would be cautious, calculated, and defensive. The army could no longer rely on speed or aggression. The Russian winter had proven that nature itself was an opponent as formidable as the Red Army. Preparation, endurance, and respect for the harsh environment would now dictate strategy on the Eastern Front. As night fell, Hoth considered the lessons of the past months. The campaign toward Moscow had been a crucible that exposed the limits of man, machine, and doctrine. Winter had humbled the Wehrmacht,
shattered illusions of rapid victory, and reshaped the nature of the Eastern Front. Hoth knew that the war would continue, but it would never again be fought as it had before. Survival, endurance, and a harsh respect for Russia itself would define every battle to come.
Section 23. Moscow holds. April 28, 1942. The outskirts of Moscow, where the last traces of winter gave way to a muddy, treacherous landscape, Hoth rode slowly along the German positions, surveying the men who had survived the harshest winter in decades. Their faces were pale, their bodies battered, yet a quiet determination persisted. Survival had replaced ambition as the driving force behind every movement, every decision, every step forward. Equipment was scarce, rations limited, and the threat of the Soviet counteroffensive ever present, yet the soldiers endured. Moscow itself remained firmly in Soviet hands. From his vantage point, Hoth could see the faint plumes of smoke rising from the city, the distant sounds of artillery punctuating the air. The defenders had weathered the German advance, and now the Wehrmacht had been forced to retreat into defensive positions, constrained by both the enemy and the lingering effects of winter. The myth of Blitzkrieg had been thoroughly dismantled on these frozen fields. Hoth walked among his officers, discussing the future cautiously. Offensive action was no longer feasible. Survival, consolidation, and careful planning were paramount. Every move had to account for the harsh realities of the environment, the limitations of his forces, and the tenacity of the Soviet defenders. The war on the Eastern Front had become a battle against time, attrition, and the relentless power of nature. In the evening, Hoth returned to his command post, surrounded by maps and reports that chronicled loss, hardship, and the slow recovery of his battered army. The winter had claimed thousands of men, immobilized countless vehicles, and shattered the illusions of rapid conquest. Moscow's survival was a stark reminder that Germany's ambitions in the East would be constrained, shaped by forces that could not be commanded or predicted. Hoth knew that the months ahead would demand endurance, careful resource management, and a deep respect for the climate and terrain. The myth of German invincibility had been destroyed, but the army remained, scarred but not defeated. Moscow had held, and with it, the harsh lesson of winter had been written indelibly into the pages of the Eastern Front. Section 24. Winter's Judgment and the Road Ahead. May 1st. The battered German positions west of Moscow where thawing ice and mud replaced snow, but the scars of winter remained etched in the landscape and in the men. Hoth stood quietly on a ridge, surveying what remained of his army. The soldiers, frostbitten, exhausted, and hardened by months of struggle, moved through the muddy fields with a grim determination. Tanks and artillery were few, many abandoned or destroyed during the harsh winter. Supplies were still insufficient, yet discipline and willpower held the army together. The campaign toward Moscow had failed, but the German army had survived, a fragile, battered force, yet still capable of fighting. Hoth reflected on the brutal lessons of the past month. Blitzkrieg, the strategy that had carried Germany to rapid victories across Europe, had been shattered by the Russian winter. The myth of German invincibility had been destroyed, replaced by the unyielding reality of frost, starvation, and the endurance of the Red Army. Moscow had held. The Eastern Front had become a test, not of speed or firepower, but of resilience, adaptation, and survival. He walked among his men, seeing the quiet acts of perseverance, soldiers sharing meager rations, tending to frostbitten comrades, and working tirelessly to salvage what equipment remained. Survival, not glory, had become the new measure of success. Every day endured was a victory. Every man preserved a triumph against the merciless conditions of Russia. Hoth returned to his command post as the sun dipped low,
casting long shadows over the thawing battlefield. Fires flickered in the encampments, illuminating faces that had seen the full horror of winter's wrath. The army had learned a bitter lesson. Nature was as formidable an adversary as any army, and underestimating it had come at a staggering cost. In his journal, Hoth wrote the final entry of the winter campaign. The advance toward Moscow had failed. The myth of Blitzkrieg was gone, and the Wehrmacht had been humbled. Yet survival had been achieved, and with it, the possibility of future operations remained. The Eastern Front would continue, but its character had been forever changed. Speed and ambition could no longer dictate the course of war. Endurance, adaptation, and respect for the forces beyond human control would now define every strategy, every movement, and every hope for victory. The winter had spoken, merciless and absolute. Moscow had held, the German army had endured, and Hermann Hoth, standing atop the frozen thawing ridge, understood that the war had changed forever. In